I'd like to welcome you to this evening's debate with Respekt. Let me also welcome everybody who's watching us online. My name is Barbora Chaloupková, and I'm here with Michael Kimmage, our very special guest for today. Michael is an American historian, former State Department diplomat, writer, and author of many books, including the newest one titled Collisions, The Origins of the War in Ukraine and the New Global Instability, which we'll be discussing today. It's absolutely amazing to have you here, Michael. Welcome. Quick note before we start, we will have time for questions from the audience, and we will address them at the end of the debate. Michael, I want to talk about as much as possible about your new book, of course, but as a way of introduction, I was thinking if you could talk a little bit about your travels with the book. You've been touring the US and Europe with Collisions in the past weeks, and I'd be interested in your observations, how the topic of the war in Ukraine is perceived in different Western countries and in the US. What are the differences?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Barbara, for the invitation to come back to the Václav Havel Library for another debate with Respekt. It's so nice to be up on the podium again with you, and although I can't read the magazine Respekt, I can have great respect for it from the people I know who are in its ambiance, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be among you this evening. So I can say two things about the book tour so far. One of them kind of frivolous, and the other maybe a touch more serious. But for some reason, every place I went in the U.S., University of Texas at Austin, Yale and Columbia, roughly a week later exploded with protest about the Middle East. So I don't know what that means about my campus visits. I don't know what it means about the book, but there was some strange phenomenon, including, Barbara, the conversation that you attended at Columbia. About a week later, the campus, which was extremely peaceful and picturesque on that particular day, became something a bit different roughly a week later. You might extrapolate from that the simple point that in the U.S., the Middle East has sort of taken over the conversation about international affairs, but that's an easy point to make at the present moment, but certainly one that I noticed on the road. I think in Europe, all I would say is this about the book. It made me understand the book better, and it's self-evident when you're over here. I think that there's a very extensive emphasis in the book on the role of the United States, and I think that's not taken for granted here. It's not that Europeans don't recognize the role that the U.S. has played either in the war or the lead up to the war, but having spent time, talking about the book in Germany, maybe unsurprisingly, Germany is somehow at the center of the story there. And I'd be very curious to learn more about the Czech Republic and its framing of the sequence of events and the significance of the war. But I'm startled now almost by how much I put the U.S. in the center of the picture. I think that distorts some things, because after all, this is an event in Europe, and its biggest meanings are about Europe. But I also think probably for European audiences, it's interesting, at the very least, to get not only an American perspective, but a perspective that puts the United States so much in the foreground. So happy to say more about that, but that's the major thing that I've noticed.
The Czech perspective might come up in the Q&A session, but let us start from the beginning. The key argument of the book is that the war should not be understood as one conflict. There are different dimensions, three collisions. Could you walk us through the argument, Michael, and explain why it is important to keep these three dimensions in mind?
Certainly, and so it is very important that the title is a noun that's in the plural, that it's not a collision, but collisions. And as if it weren't complicated enough already, I think there are probably many more than three collisions that are at work, some of which take us to the Middle East, which I've already mentioned, and that's, to me, an intriguing aspect of the current war, that the collisions are transatlantic and the collisions are European, but also global in nature. But to concentrate only on three, which is, of course, a lot, there are three axes of conflict, I think, that run directly through the current war in Ukraine. Most obviously is Russia-Ukraine. These are the two major armies that are fighting. These are the territorial issues that are of the essence with the war. And you could, with the observation of the historian Serhii Plokhy, who's written a book about the war, borrow his observation that for both Russia and for Ukraine, these are going to be state-building wars, that these are going to create new kinds of states, perhaps even new kinds of nations, obviously of a different kind, but that's the core of it. That's the heart and soul of this war. It's equally important, I think, though, to understand this as a Russia-Europe war or as a Russia-Europe collision. The story begins, I would say, not quite where the book begins, but the story begins with the association agreement offered to Ukraine by the European Union. This follows from a EU program in 2009, the Eastern Partnership Program, and that put the decision in the hands of the then president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, to figure out whether he was going to lean more toward Russia or lean more toward Europe. And he tried not to make a decision, and then in Vilnius in 2013, he decided to go with Russia, and that in turn sparked a revolution in Ukraine, which ended in Yanukovych's flight to Russia in the third week of February 2014, and then almost immediately after you get the annexation of Crimea and gradually the movement of Russian soldiers into eastern Ukraine. So there, Europe is fundamental, and there are a number of ways in which Europe remains fundamental to the conflict. One doesn't have to remind a Czech audience of how much European countries are doing to assist Ukraine militarily. That's one part of the story. Certainly for Ukraine, the European aspirations, the will to become a part of institutional Europe, is a paramount war aim. And without a question, this whole issue of Ukraine's place in Europe is very, very significant to Russia's war effort and to Russia's foreign policy aspirations with the war. So Europe is not less front and center than this Russia-Ukraine framing, but here's where the American perspective comes in. I think that the U.S. is also a very important axis of conflict. Maybe not so much in 2014, 2015, 2013. Maybe it's then more of a European story, but in terms of military assistance, the U.S. is at the top of the list. The Biden administration is juggling different foreign policy concerns, but Ukraine is very, very a very important agenda. I don't think less high than Israel-Palestine, but probably at the moment on par. And then if you look at the Kremlin's framing of the war, which may not be exactly how it's understood in the Kremlin, but the framing itself, what's apparent is that Ukraine is not a real country. It's not a significant country. It's not a proper state. Europe itself is not a geopolitical actor. In a way, Ukraine is a shell, and Europe is a shell, and behind these two shells is the United States. And so when the Kremlin describes the war as a war with the collective West, the U.S. component of that is really important. So we need to try to understand these three axes. Very final thing I'll say is I think they're all quite different as conflicts. I think they all have different points of origin. They have different dynamics, and I think they will have different conclusions. They won't all end at the same time.
I want to maybe start with the Europe-Russia collision, because as you said, I think that might be of the greatest interest to the audience here. Much of the arc the book charts is about the end of the idea that post-Cold War peace would be the norm. And it is about the slow realization that it may actually have been an exception to the norm, right? Why did it take us, most of us, something so brutal as the war in Ukraine to realize that?
It's a very significant, very important question that demands as much analytical attention as we can give it. I can think of a few overlapping reasons. The first and probably most important is just wishful thinking, that there's the desire to envision a future that's better than the present. And there was so much, especially from 1989 to the early 1990s, to encourage not just wishful thinking, but a sincere and believable optimism. The Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Empire unraveled more or less bloodlessly. A whole host of new nation states came into being. These nation states were extremely cooperative and formed a common European family. So I think it was possible to project that process out almost indefinitely. And that projection became a form of wishful thinking, which died very, very slowly. So that's one thing. The second thing I would say is that Russia's development, which is much debated among people who watch and pay attention to this country, to me, is not especially linear. You have Boris Yeltsin, who describes himself as a Democrat. who certainly wants to integrate Russia into Europe and makes all kinds of efforts. He comes to the US Congress in 1992 and says Russia is open for business, which was a message that the US Congress received very enthusiastically. You have early Vladimir Putin, 2000 to 2008, who's a Russian modernizer, somebody whose claim is that he's going to stabilize the country. And he also speaks, or at times speaks, a language of integration, of Russia possibly joining NATO, all kinds of economic forms of cooperation. And then the most nonlinear episode of them all, Dmitry Medvedev from 2008 to 2012, who goes to Silicon Valley and opens a Twitter account, gets the nickname in Russia iPhonechick, little iPhone, because of his enthusiasm for technology and for globalization. And it's easy now to go back and say all of that was the unreal Russia and doesn't tell us anything and was a side story, a footnote. But I don't think that's true. And so a lot of policymakers made all kinds of judgments and inferences on the idea that Russia would eventually or was gradually integrating into Europe and into the West. So that's an important factor as well. And then in a way, the inverse, the sort of final point that I'll make, the inverse of that second point is that I think it took policymakers and general publics, and there's a range of opinions here in the European domain, but it took them a long time to recognize how radical Vladimir Putin's foreign policy had become. There was the sense, I'll speak just for Washington in this regard and concentrate on a single word, that the State Department and the Obama administration, when Crimea was annexed and Russia installed itself militarily in eastern Ukraine, there was this term that was frequently used of an off-ramp. So the highway is going here toward peace, integration, cooperation. Russia has taken a wrong turn and needs to be given an off-ramp so it can come back onto that highway. It was a very narcissistic and foolish metaphor. And not only did it overestimate, in a sense, our powers of persuasion, but it underestimated the significance of the break between Russia and the West, already with the annexation of Crimea. And then we can move forward through a lot of familiar details, sort of Russian move into Syria in 2015, and just the kind of leader that Putin either always was or explicitly became, 2020, 2021, 2022. But in my view, the radicalism that would become obvious on the 24th of February 2022 when Putin invaded was hard to see. So you put those three things together, a kind of wishful thinking, different paths that Russia could have taken, and an inability to see how radical this figure was on the international stage, and you get, I think, that inability to recognize or to see what was coming.
You were describing a sort of presentism bias, right, in the 90s, after Cold War, after the end of the Cold War, when things were actually going well and people expected them to keep going well. But from your perspective, and that's something you address in the book as well, there was very ahistorical, right? You write that Europe's history is in many ways a history of war, that no one ever was able to control the whole continent and keep peace on the continent. Is there anything perversely special about Europe in this sense? Or is it more the case that Europe forgot much about its history more than other parts of the world did?
Maybe a few things to say about not Europe being perversely special, but simply special. And all the stranger, I think this is something historians in the future are going to struggle to explain, how all of us, I'm speaking sort of transatlantically here, came to associate Europe with peace. And that really was an organic association from the 90s afterwards. One is just the recurrence of war in Europe historically. And you can speak of the long 19th century, but even the long 19th century has the Crimean War, Franco-Prussian War, lots of smaller wars in the European space. And then, of course, the 18th century is a century of almost ceaseless war. 20th century is what we all know the 20th century to have been, impossibly bloody and brutal. And so, there's that. There's just this long shadow of war, all of these different powers that can never seem to coexist peacefully in Europe. And that is the history, and we're ill-served when we forget how important that strain of history is. Secondly, the role of empire in European history. Of course, this city speaks in so many ways to that story with different empires, but there are so many cities in Central Europe that do. And I think it was a bit foolish on our part to say, well, empire is just over, it's past. Serhii Plokhy, to speak about him again, has a title of one of his books is The Last Empire, and what he means is the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. And I wouldn't want to be too deterministic here, but empire is also a recurrent pattern in European history, and we shouldn't be too surprised that a lot of what Russia is doing now has an imperial tinge to it or coloration to it, or sort of other ways that we can return ourselves to the subject of empire. But it's there, and it's our job, I would say, to understand why empires were there in the past, what function they served, and why it is that they have a tendency to reappear. Final point, and this is what matters to me, looking at the conflict from Washington's point of view. This is maybe a touch perverse, to go back to that word in your question, Barbara. Conflicts in Europe tend to be global conflicts in ways that conflicts in the Western Hemisphere don't tend to be global conflicts. Not all conflicts in the Middle East tend to be. Conflicts in Africa tend not to be global conflicts, and conflicts in Asia maybe have that potential, but it's not like in Europe. Conflict in Europe, when there is military conflict, it radiates outward in ways that just are unique to Europe, whether it's because, Europe is so interconnected, whether because it's a place of such wealth and power in and of itself, but why it is that the two world wars have points of origin in Europe is to me a kind of haunting question. And when I think of this current war, it's also quite global in nature, and again affirming that notion of Europe as a place where conflicts, when there are conflicts, they just project. And I don't know why that's the case, but it's an aspect of the story.
Also, Europe is changed by the conflicts, right? And you write in the book that one of the outcomes of this war is sort of rooting of Ukraine in the West, that both Ukraine and the rest of Europe see the mutual relationship as very strong. How does this change both Europe and Ukraine?
So it's anybody's guess where the line of contact between Europe and Russia is going to be at the end of this war, or where the line of contact between Ukraine and Russia is going to be at the end of the war. It's my conviction, as much as I can, try to speculate about the future, that neither Ukraine nor Russia is going to win this war. It will be a war that sort of persists, but it's not going to end in the clear-cut victory of one side or the other. But I don't think that means, maybe that sounds gloomy or pessimistic, but I don't think that means that the war is going to prevent Ukraine's journey toward Europe. I think it's been too much internalized as one of the things that gives the war meaning in Ukraine. In some ways, the war itself has sort of changed the structure of the population and made it much more difficult for people in Ukraine to relate to Russia. And then there are all of the bonds that are forming of military relationships, political relationships, legal relationships, etc. So whether or not Ukraine is a member of the European Union, which I think is possible, and whether or not Ukraine is a member of NATO, which I think is unlikely for the foreseeable future, that trajectory is there. And, how much people in the West care about Ukraine is not an easy question to answer. I think a year ago when we were talking about this, it was a different level of commitment than we see at the present moment. But even if we take a somewhat cynical view of that, I think what Europeans have learned is just how significant Ukraine is to them. They may not care about Ukraine, but the conflicts in Ukraine care about them. And I think that's going to be an engine or a motor of connection between those two entities, Europe and Ukraine. Here I feel it's the sort of second point would be simply very speculative in terms of Europe. I mean, can Europe become a sort of bona fide military force? Going back to 2009 with the European Partnership Program, which offered a form of partnership to Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia. What was naive about that back then in 2009 is that it was an offer to these countries that had no security or military component. So it's as if the only connection that could be made between these countries in Europe would be one of politics or law, commerce, etc. That's no longer possible. So I think one of the ways that this war is going to change Europe is that sort of thinking is going to become a bit more inevitable. What does it mean in power political terms? What does it mean in military terms to offer a form of partnership, let's say at the moment, to a country like Georgia? Does the EU's support for Georgia's, what would it be exactly, moving beyond the Georgian dream, is that something with a security component or without a security component? And I think Europe's going to be forced to think in new ways about that and to act in new ways. I don't see that as, in and of itself, negative. It's sort of, I guess, an education in the realities of the contemporary world. But it's painful nevertheless because of all the all of the trade-offs that are going to have to be made between military spending and other kinds of spending. So it will, in that respect, certainly be a new Europe.
I think you're right that for Ukraine to fulfill its sort of desire and dream to belong to the West, it doesn't necessarily have to do it only through either NATO or the EU membership. I think that's not a very common argument. Could you talk a little bit more about it, why you think that's not, in a way, necessary?
Well, one of the things that the historical record shows us, especially with the United States perhaps, but also to a degree, to a great degree with Europe, is that when it comes to Ukraine, there's been a lot of over-promising and under-delivering. I think that those are the words I use verbatim in the book. So we go back to 2008, and you have the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008, in the spring of 2008, and George W. Bush was very enthusiastic about Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO, was willing to give them a membership action plan, so to pave the way for them to join the alliance. And, that's shot down by Germany and other European countries. And then an election takes place, and the Obama administration has no interest whatsoever in doing something like that. It ended up being empty words, and the scheme of things, rather dangerous empty words. And there is that tendency, certainly, in the United States, and you see Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is dancing exactly on that line. His recent visit to Kiev, its membership is there, it's kind of around the corner, it's almost going to happen, when his boss, President Biden, has said that there's going to be no NATO membership for Ukraine until the war is over. So if that's the position of the U.S., which I suspect it is, then better to say it and accept the consequences of that. And not stop the cooperation and security relationship with Ukraine because that's not immediately on the table, but to sort of build up in some gradual, incremental way. Under promise and over deliver. That would be such a good recipe for the United States in terms of its policy to many parts of the world, but certainly to this part of the world. And I think in Europe you get a lot of the same confusion for somewhat different reasons. EU membership depends on countries like Slovakia, Hungary, and others agreeing to Ukraine's being a member, so there's politics. But if that's the case, you also want to be careful about what you promise. And if you can't promise everything, then you think about the things that you can credibly promise, because the real danger in this is not that Washington looks less credible. I don't think that matters too much one way or another. The real promise is that you get a devastation of morale in Ukraine because of these promises and this feeling that it's 6 months away or it's a year away, and then it doesn't happen, and then it's perceived as lack of support. So it's in that spirit that I think language and reality have to be very, very closely connected.
Isn't it too late, though, for it? I think Ukraine has been promised much. How do you think that impacts the morale?
That's a question I find very difficult to answer. I think that there has been, since we are among journalists here, this is maybe a point to raise with this particular audience. Public opinion in Ukraine is a hard thing to get at. There's a very optimistic line that you get from officials. I mean, State Department officials who go and come back and say certain things. There's a lot of great reporting on the war itself. There's a lot of great reporting on the high politics of the war, but how people feel, sort of smaller communities, different regions, different social classes, because as in Russia, in Ukraine, it's the people from the lower social classes that are fighting the war. What kind of resentment that breeds, what kind of frustrations there may be with President Zelensky, frustrations with the West. I really don't know. I think there has to be a sense of gratitude for the degree of support, because it is extraordinary. But the change from last year, when we were sitting here a year ago, in terms of the war, is that it's now a war. I think it was this way that last year, but it's more visibly this way now. It's a war without end. You can't. There's no horizon. There's no vanishing point in the future where you can say it's going to be over, and that has to be maybe much harder for morale in Ukraine than perceived, changes in Western opinion. But Western opinion has to be, sort of cognizant of that. It's the issue of morale is going to be certainly the key issue of 2024. So it's exactly where our focus should be.
One more question on the institutions, because both the EU and NATO were, in a way, formed as a response to the Second World War and its aftermath. And that was a very different world than the world of today in many ways. Do you think the institutions are capable of addressing challenges of 21st century? Not that we would have anything better, right? But are they maybe, in a way, outdated in their capacity to address it?
I hope they're capable. I'll just be as sincere as possible, not to smooth over some of the challenge that I see in exactly this regard. Having looked at the history of NATO a bit for this project, although the book begins in 2008, long before or long after NATO had been created, there is one detail that leaps out to me, just as an observer of the historical story. And I think it may be distorted and may underestimate how difficult everything was in the late 1940s and early 1950s. But there is a big structural difference between NATO then and NATO now. And the difference is that Western Europe, when NATO was created, was at peace. NATO is solidified in 1949. So there's not an ongoing war apart from the Cold War, which was not a hot war in Europe. And there was an Iron Curtain, so it was unambiguous, sort of who is in, who is out, although Germany was a big ambiguity because Germany was both in and out. The city of Berlin was in and out at the same time. But still, a discrete number of countries basically bordered by the Iron Curtain on the one hand, and then the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean on the other, none of which is at war, and all of which have very long histories of sort of state and statehood and nationhood. It's easier than what NATO has to deal with now. I don't think any of us, if we can imagine designing NATO in a test tube, would have designed the NATO that we now have. And what I mean is not that NATO exists in the Czech Republic or that it exists in Eastern and Central Europe, but what do we have? We have the 3 Baltic republics in NATO, and Belarus is not. We have this little island of Kaliningrad that's there tucked behind NATO territory, behind Poland and Lithuania, and that, if you think back to an early Cold War perspective, is just so strange. We have Moldova, where there's a Russian military presence. There are also European aspirations there, something of a divided population, and that's a non-NATO country. We have the Balkans, where some countries are in and some countries are not. And if you would try to explain this to a Martian who would come, why? Why Croatia but not Serbia? Why? Sort of North Macedonia but not Kosovo. So you have all of that. And it just means that NATO is, first of all, on the front line now since 2022 or since 2014 of a major war, which it wasn't before. And also it's this kind of jagged, broken line, which is just a lot harder in military terms to defend. So I think NATO is up to the task, but the key thing is to recognize the magnitude of the task. And if we keep going back as NATO will, the 75th summit of NATO is going to take place in Washington in a few weeks, and there's going to be a lot of celebratory rhetoric and how great we are and how great NATO is, and that's fine. That's what a summit is for. But don't forget, in some ways, the new challenges that NATO has taken on and how serious the responsibilities are in the face of those challenges.
Let me ask more abstractly how the sort of new and strengthening relationship between Ukraine and Europe is changing both of these actors. Because one of the most beautiful passages of the book is when you write about Europe being more an idea than a piece of land. And because of that, it can't be sort of endlessly debated, endlessly revised. How do you think Ukraine is revising and changing the idea of what Europe is?
That's a very serious question, which takes us back to the Maidan Revolution, which is sometimes called the Revolution of Dignity, and sometimes called the Euromaidan. So, to speak in the most romantic possible terms about the Maidan Revolution, and one can speak in other terms about it, about the role of oligarchs and some of the aspects of the Maidan that were less beautiful, but to speak in the most romantic possible terms about the Maidan Revolution, and it's nice to make this point in the city of Prague when you think of what was happening here in November of 1989, but it reminds you, or reminded us, reminded Europeans perhaps, of what you could describe as aspirational Europe. that Europe is not a fortress, it's not the NATO alliance, or not only that, it's not a set of legal and commercial relationships only, but that there's a Europe of the heart. And that Europe contracts sometimes and it expands at other times precisely because Europe really is an idea. And in a way, you become European. I mean, there are qualifications to add, but you become European when you embrace that idea. Where does the word Europe come to us? It doesn't come to us from geography originally. It comes to us from Greek mythology. So it's a literary idea at the very beginning, and that's what it remains. And so if one can put to the side all of the bloodshed and all of the horror of the last 2.5 years, and all of the terribleness of this war, what you can also see is that this aspirational Europe is very much alive and is somehow growing. And I guess we could combine 2 points in one, that if the history of war is very common to Europe, but there's also this changing aspirational sort of Europe of the imagination, actually, historically speaking, those two things are often very much connected. I'm sometimes try to imagine what it would have been like to look at Europe as a European in 1942 and to see, the darkest year perhaps in European history, the Holocaust, Second World War, all of this bloodshed and suffering, and yet there were people, Robert Schuman, Konrad Adenauer, and others, who were able to imagine Jean Monnet a Europe beyond that, a Europe after 1945 that would be a different Europe and a much more sort of cooperative and integrated Europe. And that imagination is really crucial. Perhaps at the present moment, there's nothing we need more than that particular imagination, because people get so caught up in the headlines and bad news from here, bad news from there. But that imagination is probably the most essential thing at the present moment.
How do you think Ukrainian nationalism, which is an important part of the story, right? It's a war that is about a fight of an independent nation for its right to existence and self-determination. How does nationalism fit into Europe that has been built as post-national project in a way, and its institutional architecture, the EU and NATO, is post-national in principle?
Well, it fits awkwardly because, if you can forgive me for saying so here, I think the paradigmatic European nation is Germany, or the paradigmatic European country is Germany. And what happens with Germany after 1945? It has to, remake itself. It has to divest itself almost of nationalism, and Europe has to take on, or rather, Germany has to take on Europeanness, which it does. There are limits to that story too, and that whole process gets deeply interwoven into the European Union, where the price of entry almost is to be a bit less of a nation and to be a bit more a part of this larger European project or this larger European entity. And that was all rather solid until 2014 or until 2022. And if you acknowledge that Ukraine is at the heart of Europe and you acknowledge that Ukraine is European, it's doing the opposite of what Germany did in 1945. It's going to become a European nation forged in the crucible of war. So that's simply a new departure and a very interesting thing to consider. If I could tack on one additional point there, the challenge in this regard, I think, is not whether Europe will accept Ukraine as a European nation. I think that will happen. The challenge is preserving democracy in the midst of war. And I'm just not sure about President Zelensky in this regard. I'm not entirely sure. I think he is a Democrat by nature. He's certainly not an authoritarian by nature, but you've had martial law in the country now for 2.5 years, which means no elections. You also have a president who comes from the media world. President Zelensky is not just a former comedian, but a former TV producer, and he's been pretty manipulative in the way that he's tried to control media in Ukraine. Now, exactly like Woodrow Wilson in the First World War in the United States, it's not the first country in wartime to shape and control public opinion or access to information, but that, I think, is a key question. And at the same time that the war has to be in the foreground, that issue of preserving democracy can't be too far in the background, because if Ukraine deviates too far in that regard, the European path becomes that much longer and more difficult.
It's a great ask of a country in a war, right? And I can see why European countries would be hesitant to do that. Let us talk about the US dimension of the book, because that's a very important part of your book. And the US involvement is what makes the war global, in a way, in a sense, and especially U.S. involvement is what adds the potential nuclear dimension to the conflict. And the echoes of Cold War are very strong in this case. But Michael, you have argued that the situation is even more dangerous than during the Cold War. Could you elaborate on why?
Sure. And there were two moments in the Cold War when things almost ended disastrously. The first is better known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the second is, I think, 1983 or 1984. The Able Archer exercise was a NATO exercise and was interpreted in the Soviet Union as possibly an act of war. And there was some movement toward a nuclear retaliation, and that was called off. So I wouldn't want to suggest that the Cold War was without its moments of nuclear risk or potential nuclear catastrophe. But there are a couple of things that separate us from even that difficult period, and they deserve to be underscored, not to induce a feeling of panic or helplessness, but just to realize where we are. So the kind of support that the U.S. is giving to Ukraine is very different, for the most part, from the kind of support that the U.S. gave to countries in the Cold War. And maybe you've seen the film Charlie Wilson's War. There's a good book about that, an amusing film about the U.S. support for the Mujahideen of Afghanistan in the 1980s. And the U.S. is going to Egypt to buy weapons there, to pretend that they're not American weapons, and is getting donkeys to deliver these weapons into Afghanistan. All of this huge effort to show that the U.S. wasn't involved in the war, which the Soviet Union, of course, knew that it was, but still that effort was made. The pretense was there. No such pretense when it comes to Ukraine. You have very open comments from U.S. officials about the kind of support that's being given, and given very directly. When you think of the Russian casualties, how many hundreds of thousands of deaths and casualties, this is a major war, and that kind of direct military assistance is just a huge step for a country like the United States to take. So you have that, a much more fluid, dynamic, and direct conflict that's not taking us quite yet to nuclear, but that's there as a matter of context. You also have now zero diplomacy between the United States and Russia, which is an oddity of the present moment if you would look at it from the vantage point of the Cold War. Because in the Cold War, I don't know why now, it's even more mysterious to me now, living in the present, but the US and the Soviet Union, for example, could fight each other in Vietnam, which they did, in a very brutal and bloody way. But at the same time, they could do arms control, and they could have diplomacy and negotiation. That's all over with. Arms control itself is dead between the United States and Russia, and that's just a startling circumstance. In addition, you have a kind of nuclear rhetoric from Moscow that you never heard during the Cold War, about tactical nuclear weapons being an option in Ukraine. I don't think Russian political talk shows are great guides to Russian foreign policy. I think there's probably a lot of space there, so wouldn't want to respond too much to some of the statements that have been made about turning Europe or the United States into nuclear ash. But that's part of the discourse now, and that's not a Cold War story. And then finally, what makes it all, I think, even more frightening is just the role of misreading and accident. So you have Russian missiles flying into Romanian and Polish airspace. You have these episodes, and there are going to be many more of them in the months and years to come. And all of that carries with it a kind of risk that if you don't have diplomacy, if you don't have these kinds of things that can minimize that, we just live in a very dangerous moment. So I do think, I wouldn't want to over dramatize this, that there's quite a lot of awareness of this in Moscow and in Washington. And I'm relieved that you have, as director of the CIA, somebody who's a former ambassador to Russia, William Burns, who's an even-headed person who has lots of interlocutors in Russia. So it's not as if there are no channels of communication, but they are very few. And so somehow we've bid farewell to the Cold War in a very big way in this regard.
I think Cold War is interesting not just as a sort of point of comparison, but also I think it shapes imagination, Cold War, both in the US and in Russia. Because the Russia-US relationship was in many ways sort of formed by and in the Cold War. To what extent do you think the sort of mental patterns from Cold War still influence how both Russia and the US perceive each other?
Well, the comedy of these two countries at the present moment, comedy is not easy to find, but if there is comedy, it's in this. they're both quite a bit less powerful than they were during the Cold War. The United States is not the sort of dominant power that it was economically or militarily in the 1950s and 1960s. And, you know, as people are fond of pointing out in Washington, the Russian economy is roughly the size of Italy's economy, and Russia is a global power, but not one that has the global reach of the Soviet Union, nor does it have the resource of communist parties and communism, the magic of revolution that the Soviet Union used to make itself powerful in the world. So one theory I have about these two countries is one reason that they're sort of going back into these Cold War patterns of thought is that there's something a little bit reassuring about it. Sort of like when we ruled the world, the two of us were the very dominant powers. It's sort of striking to me in some ways how, and this I think is probably quite a good thing, how Russia and the United States are not fighting each other all over the world as they did during the Cold War. It was definitely felt in Washington and in Moscow. If the other side is there, we've got to be there too. So if they're in Angola, we've got to be in Angola, and if they're in El Salvador, we have to be in El Salvador. And very punishingly for the U.S., if they're in Vietnam, we've also got to be in Vietnam. So in that sense, I think that there's less of a Cold War mentality, but yes, I think it sort of plays a role in the sense of power and stature that the two countries have. For whatever reason, maybe this is different in Russia, but I suspect it isn't, there's a lot less fear than there was in the Cold War, which is odd if what I said before is true, that it's actually more dangerous in terms of potential nuclear conflict, and yet there seems to be a lot less fear. I don't think that, I mean, in the US now, people don't think too much about the war in Ukraine in general, but I know of nobody who wakes up now and says, I fear, nuclear war or some kind of direct confrontation. So the mental maps are still there, the mental patterns are still there, but the global dimension is a lot more diffuse, and the fear is less. There's less fear in the public. Certainly in the 1950s in the United States, you have a lot of, very supercharged fear of the other, and that's smaller now.
What implications for policymaking, though, does using this, in a way, outdated frame of reference, Cold War frame of reference, have? Because Russia is not a Soviet Union. The United States is very different United States than it was during the Cold War. But perceiving each other through the Cold War lens leads, I would assume, to misunderstanding of the other side.
I'm not sure. I think that the answer to the war lies in the Cold War. I'll just lay it out for you as I see it. So I think the answer to the question is there in the historical record, and it's really in the historical record of the Cold War. If what I said is true, that the war is not going to be really resolved, that there's not going to be an end to it, that it's going to last for a very long time, and neither side is going to win, that could easily be proven wrong in the next couple of months. But that's the judgment that I'll go with. I think that I'll speak again only for the U.S., but probably a lot of this might apply in Europe as well. If that's the case, that it's a long conflict, then I think the notion of containment, which is the core U.S. strategy in the Cold War, makes a lot of sense. Containment is not about getting your enemy to a position of unconditional surrender. Containment is not about rattling the other side so that it goes in a nuclear direction. And containment is not appeasement. It's not about doing nothing. It's about finding a line and trying to hold it. And so I think that itself makes quite a lot of sense as a U.S. strategy, and I think you can pull a lot from the Cold War in that regard. Defense of West Berlin is a sort of interesting example in some ways, and just the way in which NATO. I've complained about how complicated NATO has become, but important to remember that NATO really worked. It did deter the Soviet Union. There was no crossover war from the Soviet Union into a NATO member state during the Cold War. So there's a lot to learn from that as well. But I'll add one other point that goes back a little bit to what I was saying a moment ago about diplomacy. What you see with the Cold War is that it begins in anarchy. So Cold War is, nobody knows what it is. In the late 1940s, there are no rules. It's extremely confusing. Both sides, the US and the Soviet Union, are really struggling to figure out how to fight this new kind of conflict. And then when the Soviet Union gets nuclear weapons, 1949, 1950, the Cold War becomes even more confusing and complicated, and then you have these proxy wars that are fought all across the globe, and Communist China, Korean War, and that's really a period of global anarchy. But the Soviet Union and the US were able to find rules of engagement. They could figure out ways that they could not eliminate the conflict between the two countries, but if they could find ways that they could manage that conflict. That's my deepest hope. That's my deepest source of optimism over the years. Rules of engagement will be found, and you can minimize the bloodshed, you can minimize the sort of hot elements of the war, not get rid of them, but make them smaller and make them less dangerous. And there I think there's a role for diplomacy and sort of creative diplomacy at that. And all of the lessons I think are there in the Cold War. So I don't mind the Cold War mentality if it's not one of missionary zeal or panicked fear. I think strategically the Cold War is where we need to go, not to figure out the past, but to figure out the future.
I think that's a good distinction. Collisions is in a way, at least that's how I read it, a courageous book in a sense, because it is a very early history. It's not sometimes even history at all. And you, as a historian, must have felt probably that it's a little bit out of your comfort zone. I was thinking, what kind of information did you wish you would have an access to that would allow you to make either different conclusions, stronger conclusions? If you could pick any sort of information, imagine it.
Well, I think that we who are in the teaching profession, we should really live for our students. And one of the best things that you can do for your students is give them something to argue against and give something where they can do better than you did. And I think in that respect, I'm very, very satisfied with the results of Collisions, because it's going to inspire, I think, whatever students might read it with that ambition, I think, to do a better job and to come up with better arguments and to tie loose ends together much, much more than I was able to do. So, in that sense, I feel very much at home with what the book is able to accomplish. But in other respects, you couldn't be more right that there is almost no evidence for any of this, which is a problem if you're going to write history, because you usually write history on the basis of some kind of evidence. So we have a little bit on U.S. decision-making. That's not so opaque to me. I would say I have a feeling for that. I do live in Washington. I get, sort of inklings of what the decision-makers thought and felt about this, but I don't have any documents, and I have no real evidence. So that's, really, really difficult. Ukraine, in terms of its decision-making, I'm not aware of good bodies of evidence there. There's some journalism, but it's really hard. But this is what I would want, and I think what we may never get. What I would want is real evidence about Putin's understanding of his country's foreign policy and his, understanding of strategy and his decision-making. So one of the biggest questions when it comes to the war is, when did President Putin decide to wage this war? And I've heard arguments that it's a week before, and I've heard arguments that it goes back to 2000, if not even earlier, which I find absurd. But still, I mean, there are people who make the claim, or that it's in the DNA of all Russian people to wage this war. And so it's, you find the answer to the question 600 years ago. You could take it back. You could take it back that far. But whether it's far in the past or not far in the past, the point is we just don't know. We have no clue. And so here we are, sort of talking about these really important issues about who's doing what, when, what the motivations are, and you really can't come up with great diplomatic or strategic solutions if you don't know the motivations, or it helps, certainly, and we're just in the dark. And so I will confess that this book is probably half a work of fiction, and, half is, maybe some mixture of journalism and proper history, but the whole chapter that deals with the question of when and how Putin made the decision to wage the war, it's all fictionalized, because you also can't just leave it blank. I mean, it's not the book that you would want to read. You have to write some other book in that case, and so we're going to struggle with that, I suspect, for a long time. And even if there would be, I know that some of my sort of historian friends dream of this, that there would be a defector from the Kremlin and would come and say, this is what it all was and this is what it all meant. I wonder. You would have to then make all the judgments about how honest and accurate that might be.
I think any work of historical analysis basically has to contend with one big question, and that is sort of adjudicating the balance between the big forces, the structures on one side, and on the other side, the human, like individual decisions, people. In the case of this war, where do you see the balance between those two ends of the spectrum?
Yeah. So the big structures I could articulate in the following way, which is two intersecting dilemmas that are really deep in the history of the last 300-400 years. And the intersecting dilemmas are as follows, and these are the structural patterns, I think, from which we can begin to understand this war. That Europe, as we've already discussed, doesn't know where it ends. It's nice to put this in the context of the Eurovision Song Contest, where you have Azerbaijan is a part of this Europe, and Israel and countries in a way far afield. But it's Azerbaijan, but it's definitely not Iran, and it's Israel, but it's definitely not Tunisia. So it's already very sort of intriguing about how far Europe can go or how far it doesn't go. But especially, not to be too lighthearted about it, where it concerns Central Europe and Eastern Europe, this is a very difficult question on the European side. I mentioned a moment ago the country of Belarus. I mean, in a way, if we all affirm, as many of us do, that Ukraine is a place that is now in the heart of Europe, then why not Belarus? I mean, what's the difference, really? I mean, that yes, there are cultural and historical, geographic differences, but hard to say. And of course, you have the Belarusian government in exile in Vilnius that's very much waiting to make Belarus a European country. So it's not as if this is a decided matter. And if Belarus is going to be Europe, then why not Russia? What's the difference there? I mean, why would you really draw such a big distinction? And we could now say, since the door has closed between Russia and the West, that it was never a possibility. But that's definitely not how the U.S. and Europe looked at this matter for much of the 90s and thereafter. There was definitely the sense that Russia was a country within and inside of Europe. So this is a dilemma in a way, that you don't know where Europe ends. But what makes the dilemma supercharged is that Russia doesn't know where it ends, or doesn't wish to know where it ends. There are billboards now in Moscow that say that Russia has no borders, as a kind of official message of the Russian government. And if you look at the Russian constitution, in which 4 oblasts of Ukraine, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk, are officially Russia, even though not all of them are under the control of the Russian military. Certainly, we know from the beginning of the war that Kiev was supposed to be a part of, sort of Russia broadly construed. Belarus is definitely a part of Russia in sort of security terms, but not legally, not officially. Where does Russia end? And if you can't figure out where one place ends and the other place begins from both sides, it's very likely that you're going to have conflict. So I think that when you think through that dilemma, you get some sense structurally of why we're not accidentally where we are. And you could go back in the Second World War, First World War, earlier conflicts, and actually see how important the territory of Ukraine is to broader European geopolitical conflicts. But I also feel a little bit worried about very structural readings of this. I would want to emphasize that there is a core accident at the heart of the current war, and it's almost, well, it is upsetting to think of this as a function of an accident because so many people are dying and this war is so terrible. But of course, it's happened once before, and it's neatly symmetrical. It's 100 years before. You have the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in June of 1914. A weird accident in, may the city of Sarajevo forgive me, but in a place that's sort of Europe's periphery, not the core of Europe, and yet this peripheral event, seemingly random event, sets in motion the First World War, which is this event of such enormous magnitude. And ever since, historians have been trying to find these structural explanations, but it always hits up against the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Well, 100 years later, we have the flight of Viktor Yanukovych from Ukraine. In a way, Russia, Europe, and the US had a plan for Ukraine, and so did Ukraine in February of 2014, and they agreed on the plan, and it was not something that fell apart. And 10 years earlier, 2004, the Orange Revolution, Russia, Europe, and the US also figured it out peacefully. The plan in February 2014 was that Yanukovych would stay in power until December, and there would be an election in Ukraine, and Yanukovych would lose, and he would be able to leave power. Something else would begin, and presumably there wouldn't have been war. Now, there were lots of reasons why that would have been difficult to get to, but still, Yanukovych runs away. He flees. And then all of this stuff begins to happen, to me, in a rather contingent, chaotic, anarchic, of the moment way. And there's our non-structural push. So you do have the structural factors, of course, but accident and contingency is you can just feel it in this conflict. And we need to qualify sometimes our very structural readings with a recognition of that.
I think there is like strong structural reading of the war in Ukraine, and then you have the very personalistic accounts of psyche of Putin, right? Sure. But he's not the only interesting individual in this story. Like, your book has a great chapter. You mentioned Dmitry Medvedev, the one-time Russian president. You describe really interestingly his relationship with Barack Obama. Both of these men are in a way out of picture right now, but they were at the origins of the war. The way Obama described Medvedev is, he said he was young, trim, clothed in hip European tailored suits. He smelled more than Putin. He was boyish in demeanor. He was the great modernizer of Russia. He was supposed to be the great modernizer of Russia. And today, Medvedev's comments on the war in Ukraine, I think are, even by Russian standards, one of the most outlandish ones. What happened to Dmitry Medvedev and people like him?
Well, that's a hard question to answer. He's an especially mysterious figure. I'll give you the real answer to your question, and then take us back to the Medvedev who you could invent, and who I think was invented between 2008 and 2012. I mean, Medvedev is, like many people in Putin's orbit, he's pretty much a mediocrity. He wouldn't have risen up by his own charisma or sort of rhetorical brilliance or deep intelligence. So he's very much dependent on the boss. He's a company man, there was a brief moment where he disagreed with some of the things. He disagreed with President Putin, perhaps, or perhaps it was a game, but perhaps they disagreed about Libya and the NATO bombing of Libya in 2011. He certainly spoke a quite different language, but he knew who he was working for when he was the president. He was sort of called up by Putin, to be sure. And when Putin muscled him out of the picture and returned to power in 2011, 2012, it's not as if Medvedev mounted a mutiny as Prigozhin did last year, or went to the streets or tried to speak to people or even complain about his predicament. He went along with everything as a good company man would. And so his perks, privileges, position, status within that system, it all depends on the relationship to Putin. You could say in the language of communism that he sort of overfulfills the plan now in terms of his language and rhetoric. And, there's the speculation that he's an alcoholic and he sort of tweets when he's drunk, which would be a possible explanation. But it is, he's sort of gone as far in the direction of supporting the war as one could. But it's not really inconsistent with the pattern. If you have to show the boss in a way how loyal you are at the present moment, that's certainly what he's doing. But why was it in 2008 and 2012 that you could imagine otherwise? Well, first of all, you couldn't see the future. That's part of it. But I think he also spoke, speaking only for President Obama, a very seductive language. That he's like Putin, he's trained as a lawyer. In fact, they had the same law professor in St. Petersburg. But that was sort of seductive, that he speaks a language of bureaucracy and law. And he said, for American ears, a lot of the right things, as I quote in the book. When you have the Arab Spring, Medvedev says, 2011, well, when people get annoyed with their government, that's what they do, and that's good that they do that, which is obviously not the message of the Russian government, under Putin when it comes to similar such episodes of street protest and moving against the government. So you have that, and you had, I think this was maybe most seductive of all for the U.S., Medvedev's fascination with technology. And that his signature plan, is to build the Silicon Valley outside of Moscow, which he tried to do. And he went to Silicon Valley and was really amazed by it. But I can just leave you with this image of those years and of the relationship between Medvedev and Obama, because I was startled to see it when I went back to look at it for this book. There's a famous meeting between Medvedev and Obama, I think it's 2010 or 2011, called the Hamburger Summit at a hamburger restaurant that no longer exists, Ray's Hellburger in Arlington, Virginia. And you see these photographs of the two kind of young guys with their shirt sleeves rolled up, and they're eating hamburgers, and there are all these, sort of condiment bottles on the table, and it looks like they're in an American diner, sort of eye to eye, two good friends. But behind them, and I don't know why this was there in the hamburger restaurant, but behind them is a poster for the film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is a 1920s Weimar era horror film. So that to me is the kind of omen that they were sharing hamburgers, but there was something something on the horizon that was going to be different.
Last question before we open it to the audience. But when I think of Medvedev and people like him, I ask the question also partially because I think about the question, and it's a speculative question, I know, but to what extent Russian elites really do believe what they're saying today about the West, about NATO, about the EU. And I think it's important also because if you go back to the Soviet Union and you said, like, Medvedev, he's not overpromising, overdoing the plan. But when you go back to the Soviet Union, so the sort of dissonance between what was said and what was believed was at some point so wide that it was basically made the whole regime untenable. And I don't know if this is something where we might be heading in Russia, or if the people truly do believe that.
That distance is definitely there. You could see it at the beginning of the war with those televised episodes where people from the government had to sort of show their support for the war, and you could kind of see how they were going through the motions. There's definitely a language that you have to speak now in Russian officialdom when it comes to the war, when it comes to politics. There are attitudes that have to be held, and that's held, I think, as a matter of etiquette, almost. It has ritualistic elements to it, and that, of course, is somewhat reminiscent of the Soviet Union. But I would also emphasize the differences. There's a big difference between an ideology like communism and this unbelievably strange thing that was the Soviet Union, these different republics, and the whole construct of it was in so many ways so unnatural. There's a huge difference between that and nationhood. And what happens in 1991, it happens in this country, earlier it happens across the former Soviet Union, is that you have all of these new nations, but that also happens in Russia. And in a way, the Russia that you get in 1991 is the most Russian Russia you've ever had. It's territorially much smaller, but there are far fewer non-Russians under Moscow's control. So it becomes much more of a nation after 1991. And so that language of nationalism, or that language of nationhood, especially in wartime, yes, is constructed, and there's an official element, and of course it's criminalized. You can't speak against the war if you're in Russia. That's a criminal offense, and people have been persecuted for that. But there is, I think, a sincere language of nationhood. The way I would characterize it, I can't say for Russian elites. I think there's a gradation, a kind of spectrum. Some are true believers. It didn't seem to help Mr. Patrushev, who was just demoted, who's one of the truest of the true believers, but that is neither here nor there. There's a gradation, I think, within, obviously Foreign Minister Lavrov doesn't believe 3/4 of what he says, and I think he thinks this is a foolish war, and he's kind of miserable. You can kind of see it in his body language and his face, but he's an ornament to the regime. He doesn't particularly matter in terms of policy making. But the population, I think, divides between people who have a very sort of sincere wartime nationalism and those who are anti-war. And those are probably a minority who are really, truly anti-war, but anti-war in the sense of not wanting to lose. And that, I think, is not a Soviet position, and it's not a manipulated position, and it's not a forced position. It's actually something that probably comes from the bottom up of society, in which the Kremlin is then able to channel. And of course, Putin's skill as a politician is to take things that are happening spontaneously and then to make them political. It's not just that everything is invented in the Kremlin. That's really the wrong model. And the war has recalibrated that in many, many ways. And so far, on the Russian side, is sort of working in a way that I think, compared to the Soviet war in Afghanistan, which is just a disaster in terms of morale, and nobody knows what they're fighting for, and creates all these internal problems and difficulties. That's definitely not the setup we have circa 2024.
We'll take the questions from the audience. Please raise your hand and you'll get a microphone. If there are too many questions, we can take two at once, but let's start there.
Hello. I would like to follow up on the structural distinction and the human level, because you have talked a lot about, let's say, the longer-term structural collisions, let's say, of the path that, let's say, the West and Russia was on. Now, war or conflict is also, even almost by definition, a failure of deterrence. And maybe looking at this from a more direct or shorter-term perspective, do you think Putin or Kremlin or the Russian regime was in fact deterrable, even in the moment when already the plans were set, for example, where cooperative relationship was long gone? Was it still possible to avoid the war in, let's say, the winter of 2021, 2022? Thank you.
Great, thanks for the question. I wouldn't be an academic if I didn't say that I've just written an essay on this topic, which I commend to all of you, sort of free and in the public domain, about the failure of deterrence. So it's very much on my mind, and really a question I want to get to to the bottom of. I can give a very simple answer to your, really precise question, which is I think by 2021, 2022, it's way too late, and there's absolutely no way that Russia could have been deterred. The U.S. tried with sanctions or the threat of sanctions, that failed miserably. Where there's an interesting either miscommunication or misunderstanding or just episode is that you have CIA Director Burns, who goes to Moscow, I think, in early December of 2021, and he lays out the things that the U.S. is going to do if Russia invades. And I just wonder if they talked past each other. He didn't get to meet with Putin. He had to call him from a phone box and express that stuff by telephone. So I wonder there if there wasn't maybe some deterrent possibility if he had been a bit more forthright, or if Putin had listened to what he was saying. But I think in a way that's a very small hypothetical. I think it was way too late. I'll just briefly say why I think that's the case. I think deterrence of this war, it might have, if you had been thinking along the lines of really deterring Russia in 2011, 2012, then it might have worked, and that would have meant comprehensively building up Ukraine's military in ways that would really, the Air Force, the military, the Navy. Had that been a 10-year project starting in 2012, I think, Ukraine and its supporters would have been in a very different place in 2011 or 2021, 2022. Why didn't that happen? Some of it we've been over before, some of the wishful thinking about Europe and European integration, that certainly plays a role. I find Western diplomacy toward Ukraine all the way up until 2022 just to be lazy. It's like, well, maybe it matters, maybe it doesn't, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, maybe we can say this, maybe we can really half mean it. And so that very laziness of not being precise, not being careful in language, not sort of threatening what was really threatening, I think itself contributed to a failure of deterrence. And I think also, when I said before about not seeing Putin's radicalism, that there's just an underestimation of Russia that's chronic until 2022. And that underestimation is that they're not going to do it. It doesn't make sense for them. So it's not even a thinkable event. And if it's not thinkable, then it's not deterrable. But also that if Russia does it, our sort of economic tools are going to be so strong that it's not going to work. And that didn't pan out. And also, if Russia does it, there's not going to be enough social cohesion in Russia for the war to work also. So sort of Russia will implode if it takes on an event of this magnitude. And all of that, I think all of those mindsets and attitudes which vanish on the morning of the invasion made deterrence so much more difficult. But the very final thing to say is that, of course, nobody in 2011, 2012 was thinking of deterring Russia and Ukraine. Maybe in Eastern Central Europe, that's a bit different. I don't want to confuse the U.S. with Europe in this regard, but certainly nobody in the U.S. was thinking of deterring Russia in those years, which is a big part of the explanation of why Russia was impossible to deter a decade later.
I think it's interesting then the underestimation of Russia went hand in hand with overestimation of its military capabilities. But yeah, another question.
Yeah, cool, thank you. I'm just curious, I don't know if it's of interest to anyone else, but you talked about, Barbora, you asked the question about what are the information that you'd like to have? So that led me to thinking, what are actually your sources when you're writing about Russia? Because I assume you don't go there. And who do you trust? What sources do you trust? Who do you trust? Who is maybe there? Who do you trust from the Western analysts, let's say? Or do you trust, Chinese analysts who have their own interest in the whole thing? So how do you work and maybe even try to predict things in an environment where that is basically so information poor?
Yeah, I hope everybody's interested in the question, because it really seems crucial for policymaking. How do we know what we know? And what judgments can we make? What conclusions can we draw? In terms of the people I happen to have been in touch with, I don't know if these are familiar names, people like Dmitry Trenin and Fyodor Lukyanov. It's interesting to me that they were both wrong about the war. They were both convinced that it was not going to happen, and also convinced that it wasn't a good idea. Both of them sing a very, very, very different tune in the present moment. But that was their, sort of attitude and mindset before the war. So that made me realize, many others as well, that even foreign policy experts in Moscow, who are in the loop in some ways, when it came to this war, of course, the war was conducted at the beginning in a lot of secrecy, they were definitely not in the loop. I can say I think what you don't want to do in this regard, and this is to boil down too many of these questions to Vladimir Putin's psychology. And my least favorite method of this, and it crops up in so many sort of TV shows that I've seen about the subject, is the anecdote of Putin as a young boy being cornered by a rat in his Leningrad apartment, and from this the conclusion is drawn that when he's cornered he lashes out, and that's a kind of pop psychology that I think we all really want to avoid when it comes to making any kind of serious statement about intentions. I think the character of Putin certainly matters. I think his speeches and public statements also matter in some ways. If we go back to the summer of 2021 and his essay about Ukrainians and Russians being one people, that definitely set off a lot of alarm bells in the U.S. government, and that was a bit of a roadmap to what he was going to do. So that's you don't always know, because there are a lot of different statements which ones are going to be the truly relevant ones. But sometimes what's right in front of your nose is something resembling the truth. So there's that, and I think you can also read the biography of Putin and try to understand his personality. He may not lash out when cornered, as the rat anecdote would have us believe, but he tends not to back down. I think that is true. He doesn't always respond immediately or quickly to things, but he doesn't, to my knowledge, back down much. And I think that that's certainly a relevant data point. But I would play all of the Putin stuff against what could be described as Russian strategic culture. And this, speaking only for the United States, is something that I think we understand very, very poorly in the United States. Actually, the number of English language books on this topic is strangely small. And strategic culture comes from history, it comes from geography, it comes from state-society relationships. And I don't think in this sense, again, having made fun of the rat story, I'll make fun of another quote that drives me a bit crazy, is Churchill's "Russia is an enigma wrapped in a mystery, swaddled in fog, and impossible to..." It's not. I mean, all countries have histories, and all countries have strategic cultures, and you can work on them, and it's not going to be predictive exactly of the future, but it can provide something of a map. So I think between Putinism and a careful study of Russian strategic culture is the best that we can do. But in terms of actual evidence, to go back to the very beginning part of your question, we never have it. So that's unfortunately just a precondition.
Thank you for the great debate. And I have a question about, what do you think about deterrence power of NATO and a possibility that Russia or Putin will try to test our unity somewhere, maybe Baltic states or somewhere else?
So it's very common when NATO is not having a summit and not congratulating itself. It's very common, which NATO of course likes to do, but it's very common for NATO and for debates around NATO to be burdened by the language of crisis. And of course we're living in wartime, and there are lots of crises, and they're never ending. Georgia is in the midst of a crisis. Perhaps your neighbor Slovakia is in the midst of a crisis. At the present moment, there's the environmental crisis. There are all these crises, and it's fairly typical to begin a conversation about NATO with this sense of crisis. So one thing I would want to say in response to your question is that NATO is very successful at what it does, and has always been very successful at what it does. In a way, NATO really understands what deterrence is. And there's, of course, the nuclear umbrella, which is an important part of it. There are much more practical efforts in terms of deterrence. There's Article 5, which we can debate. Is it as credible as it was before? Will it change with the U.S. election? You can have those debates, but let's acknowledge first and foremost that the Article 5 commitment is real, and it's the backbone and it's the underpinning of an extremely successful defensive and deterrent alliance. Now, NATO's out-of-area operations, Afghanistan, Libya, that's a different story, but I don't think that could really be characterized as deterrence. It was something else. So when it comes to deterrence, we do want to remind ourselves not only to think about crises, but to remember that NATO is brilliantly good at what it's doing. I do think that point is acknowledged in Moscow. In a way, not wanting Ukraine to join NATO is a manner of paying respect to NATO. And that's one part of it. I also don't think that there's too much to be gained on the Russian side from a direct confrontation with NATO. And by that I mean, if you have Kaliningrad, why would you need the port of Riga as well? Why do you need two Kaliningrads? Is that really necessary? Are the risks that would be involved in something like that sort of worth the payoff? Are you going to antagonize Poland, which is not, China, but it's a country of 30 million with a pretty serious military that certainly would respond? Do you really want to risk that degree of escalation with the United States, whether it's a President Trump or a President Biden who's in office? I'm very skeptical that those risks would be undertaken. I think there are other ways that Russia will try to challenge and to provide difficulties for NATO, but I think in a way what Russia needs is not what Russia itself can create. What Russia needs is internal problems within NATO countries, big fissures, big disagreements, sort of big confusions. And if that could be augmented and NATO can be made less effective or less credible, that's probably as much as is achievable. Unless Russia were to win the war very quickly, take over all the territory of Ukraine, and then in some sort of state of hubris start to think very differently about things. But we're pretty far from that outcome at the moment.
I think we will have time for one last question, if there is one.
Yes. Thank you for your analysis. I've really enjoyed this. I was struck by your characterization of wishful thinking as our why we missed Putin's sort of character. And I completely agree with that. I remember, the optimism that was built in the warm glow of the end of the Cold War. We all wanted things to be a certain way. But America, in addition to wishful thinking, also the other common characteristic of American foreign policy is paranoid pessimism. And we sort of careen back and forth between those two. And so this is probably not fair to ask a historian, but looking today, what would you identify as something that's either wishful thinking or paranoid pessimism in our views?
Well, as Barbara has already pointed out, I've written a book without evidence, so as a historian, I can jump in and take on any question, past, present, or future, without.
That was not my point.
without embarrassment. So it's a really good question about the present moment, because in terms of the willingness to write a book like this without the right really sort of sources and text, my sense of urgency comes from wanting to learn from the historical record, whatever it is that we can learn. So if that's the frame for the book, then what really matters is what do we take and emphasize in the present and think about in terms of the in the future. So maybe wishful thinking, I'll start there so that I can end with a small attack on paranoid pessimism, and then that puts us hopefully in the spirit of pragmatic optimism at the end of the conversation. Wishful thinking. I think in the U.S. case, since you were asking about American foreign policy, the obsession with technology and the obsession with technology is something that improves or necessarily improves. You could look here. We have evidence here. We do have evidence from the war itself that a lot of the Western-trained Ukrainian units have performed more poorly than Ukrainian-trained Ukrainian units. And a lot of the promises that the American military leaders made to the Ukrainian military on the eve of the counteroffensive last summer really concern technology. We have all these technological capacities that we're going to provide, and that's going to be a huge difference in the war. And that just is writ large, I think, a general problem with American foreign policy. The sense that technology is the answer, that it's going to give us these big advantages, or it's going to make people sort of more democratic, more sort of peaceful, more cooperative. I don't. When it comes to the internet, I don't think that's the mood of the moment, but it certainly was 10 years ago. But it can come back because it's somehow in the American DNA to be excited and optimistic about technology. So there's one place where I would want to be careful about wishful thinking. And in some ways, when it comes to geopolitics, whether it's Europe or Africa at the moment, the Middle East and Asia, there's not an overabundance of wishful thinking. So maybe I'll just leave it at the point about technology. Now, paranoid pessimism, I think, for the U.S. crystallizes around China. It manifests itself in a few ways. One is a very crude lumping together of North Korea, Iran, Russia, and China, sometimes referred to as the axis of the aggrieved, or the different people have different words for the axis of whatever they are, a little bit reminiscent of the axis of evil that was made famous during the global war on terrorism. I think this just takes a lot of nuance out of things. sort of going back to me, like the really ugly chapters of the Cold War of defining certain things in absolutely in the category of worry with a certain amount of demonization that also comes with that. And there we would be well served by just looking carefully at what are the differences among these countries. Are they the same? Are they different? They're clearly in many ways quite different, and not building the paranoid, pessimistic narrative before it's really true. So that's one thing to say. I mean, Taiwan is not a matter of paranoid pessimism. That would be glib, because that's a serious foreign policy issue, and that there are many good reasons why there's huge concern about that. But I often feel it gets posed in a way that's melodramatic, as if this is around the corner, as if this is truly what China wishes to do, and I'm simply not convinced. So. There I think I would want to, be a bit more reserved. And then finally, since this is the news of the last couple of days with President Putin's visit to Beijing, maybe just a word or two about the Russia-China relationship, which is probably a good occasion for paranoid pessimism from a Western point of view, because they command a lot of resources and it's a close relationship and they have big ambitions. The famous quote from Xi Jinping that we're seeing changes of a kind that we haven't seen for 100 years. And you, Russia, and we, China, are sort of the driving force behind these changes. There is that, and there are lots of things that China has done to enable Russia to fight its war in Ukraine. But I also think that there are lots of ways in which Beijing is very concerned and worried about this war. It happens to get in the way of its major project, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is supposed to go to Southern Europe and Eastern Mediterranean, Port of Piraeus and Greece. And here you now have a massive sprawling war in the midst of that. I think that the war itself, going back to the title of the book, creates too much instability for China. And you got a little bit of that even in the Xi Jinping Putin conversations of the last couple of days. It's China frames the war as a question of stability. He blames the West for being at fault, but he frames it as a matter of stability, which is a very different framing from what you get in the Kremlin. So for the U.S., going back to the U.S. and that sort of paranoid pessimism, if we are paranoidly pessimistic about only that, about China's role in the war, we may miss some of the ways in which China can bring a quicker end to the war, or be a factor in moderating the war. And actually, if you look at President Zelensky, he's very capable of, he wants to have the phone call with Xi Jinping, and he wants to have a relationship. The biggest trading partner of Ukraine before the war was not Germany, and it wasn't the U.S. It was China. I have no doubt when it comes to the reconstruction of Ukraine, China is probably going to be the first country in line. And so let's maybe think of ways to embrace that and turn it to the good, and not relitigate this kind of good and evil, black-white, Cold War mentality that only saw things in that manner. So let's conclude our evening by speaking out against paranoid pessimism.
So let's conclude on the pragmatic optimism.
Pragmatic optimism.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. And most of all, let me thank you, Michael, for being here with us. Congratulations on the book. And it's been, as always, a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Barbara, thank you so much.